The sun had barely begun its gentle ascent over the horizon as I moved through the quiet house, a cup of steaming tea warming my hands and a sense of calm settling over me that only mornings like this could bring. I had always believed that my life was a storybook, the kind of life that people whispered about with envy. A happy marriage, a home filled with laughter and warmth, and a son who had grown into a man that made my heart swell with pride. Every milestone he had reached, every achievement had been a reflection of the love and guidance I had poured into him from the moment he was born, and now here we were standing on the precipice of a new chapter, a chapter that was supposed to be the culmination of dreams, a wedding, the joining of two souls, the beginning of another family. And yet I could not shake the flutter of unease that had settled in my chest. Like an uninvited guest, I had watched Ion grow from a boy who clung to my hand in fear of the dark into a young man who walked into the world with confidence and determination, and now he was about to marry Zara, and I had believed with every fiber of my being that she was the perfect match, the missing piece of our puzzle, the one who could love him and cherish him and make him as happy as I had always wanted him to be. She was charming with her delicate features and her laughter that seemed to fill every room with light, her intelligence apparent in the way she spoke about her work, her dreams, her aspirations, and the way her eyes lit up whenever they met. As I remember the first time they came to visit our home, the way Ion's face softened in her presence, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person who had ever truly seen him, and I had smiled thinking that he had found someone who would love him as fiercely as I did, someone who would be worthy of the life we had built together. And as the months passed and the wedding plans took shape, I had thrown myself into every detail, from the flowers to the menu to the seating arrangements, making sure that every choice reflected the love and joy that was supposed to define this union. And yet there was an undercurrent I could not ignore, a tension in the air that I could not name, a fleeting glance between Zara and one of Ion's friends, a hesitation in her smile when she thought I was not looking, a subtle restlessness in the way she moved through our home. All of these things seemed insignificant alone, but together they formed a pattern that whispered of something hidden, something dangerous. And on the night before the wedding, when the house was filled with the soft hum of activity, the smell of fresh roses, and the faint notes of music drifting from the living room, I found myself alone in Ion's childhood bedroom, organizing his photos, his baby pictures, his first day of school, the images that traced the map of his life, a life that had been mine to nurture and protect. And it was then that she appeared, Zara, standing in the doorway, her presence sudden and deliberate, her perfume sweet and overpowering, and yet there was a hardness in her eyes, a sharpness that made my heart constrict. And she leaned close, lowering her voice until it was a whisper that cut through the warm calm of the evening, and the words she spoke echoed in my mind like a warning, like a threat. Tomorrow you won't be family anymore. And I froze, unsure if I had heard correctly, unsure if the fear that had been gnawing at the edges of my consciousness was now solid and real. I laughed nervously at first, telling myself that it was a joke, that she was trying to scare me with a playful threat, but the seriousness in her gaze told me that there was no jest, no hidden sweetness, no hint of affection behind what she had said. It was a declaration, a promise of upheaval and betrayal, and I wanted to reach out to her to demand answers, to pull the truth from her lips. But before I could move, she had turned and left, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and the sudden cold that had settled in my bones. And I sat there on the edge of Ion's bed, staring at the photographs, the happy moments frozen in time, and wondering how everything I had believed in could be so fragile, how the life I had carefully built could be threatened in a single whispered sentence. And the night stretched on around me, the quiet of the house broken only by the ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the floorboards under my restless steps. And I thought about all the times I had trusted people blindly, the mistakes I had made in believing the best of everyone, and I realized that trust was a dangerous thing that could be used as a weapon as easily as it could be a gift. And my mind turned to Ion, to his happiness, to the joy that he had found in Zara, and I felt a surge of protective instinct, stronger than I had ever known, stronger than any love I had felt in all my years. And I vowed that no matter what it took, I would uncover the truth, I would shield him from whatever storm she was bringing with her. I would not let the foundation of our family crumble without a fight. And as the hours dragged on, I revisited every interaction I had had with Zara, every smile, every compliment, every touch, searching for cracks, for hints, for anything that could confirm the fear that had settled in my chest. And slowly a pattern began to emerge, a flicker of cunning behind her charm, a subtle manipulation in her words, a calculated softness in her gestures. And it became clear that she was not just a young woman in love. She was someone with a purpose, a plan, a hidden agenda that I could not yet fully understand, but knew instinctively would affect the person I loved most in the world. And as I sat there, surrounded by memories of Ion's life, from his first steps to his graduation, the moments that had defined our family, I realized that the perfect life I had imagined was fragile, and that sometimes the people we let closest to us are capable of the greatest betrayals. And the night passed in restless thought and fear and in determination, and when dawn broke and spilled golden light across the living room, I knew that everything would change tomorrow, that nothing would be the same, and I felt a mixture of dread and resolve. Because for the first time I understood that love alone was not enough, that protecting the ones we care for required vigilance, courage, and the willingness to confront even the most beautiful illusions, for in the heart of betrayal there was a truth waiting to be revealed, and I was determined that I would see it through, no matter the cost, no matter the pain, because Ion was worth it, my family was worth it, and the whispered words of a woman who claimed to love him had awakened a fire within me that I could not ignore, a fire that would guide me through the coming storm, and I clutched the photographs to my chest and whispered a silent promise to the boy I had raised, to the man he had become, that no one would hurt him, no one would take away his happiness. And with that promise echoing in the corners of the room, I prepared myself for what tomorrow would bring, knowing that the eve of a wedding was not just a celebration but a battlefield in disguise, and I would not let my son step onto it unarmed or unaware. The morning sun filtered through the curtains and spilled across the wedding hall, casting golden light on every corner, and yet the brightness of the day did little to calm the storm that had begun to rage in my heart, for the unease that had settled over me the night before had not lifted, and I found myself moving through the house with a careful deliberation, noticing every glance, every movement, every whispered conversation, as if the walls themselves could tell me what I needed to know, and I could not shake the words that had been spoken to me, the chilling promise that tomorrow I would no longer be family, replaying over and over in my mind with each repetition, gnawing at my confidence and my sense of peace. I had watched Ion from the moment he had woken, his face bright with excitement, his eyes sparkling with the anticipation of the day that was supposed to mark the beginning of the rest of his life, and I wanted to smile with him, to share in his joy, but the shadow of doubt lingered, making it impossible for me to fully immerse myself in the happiness that surrounded us, and I began to notice subtle things that in any other circumstance would have seemed insignificant, but now struck me with the weight of warning, the way Zara laughed a little too loudly at jokes that were not funny, the way her gaze lingered on people in the room with a curiosity that seemed more calculating than friendly, the fleeting expressions of discomfort that crossed the faces of Ion's friends when she spoke to them, as if they sensed something beneath the surface that I could not yet name, and it was then that I saw at the first real glimpse of what lay behind her mask, a brief exchange with Farhan, Ion's best friend, that had gone unnoticed by everyone else, two people leaning close enough to speak softly, their eyes meeting with an intensity that made my heart seize, and though nothing untoward had occurred in that moment, the tension was undeniable, and instinct screamed at me to pay attention to the subtle signals that could not be ignored, and I tried to push it from my mind, telling myself that it was natural for two friends to share private words, that it did not mean anything, but the whisper of intuition would not be silenced, and I found myself compelled to investigate, compelled to protect my son from the possibility of heartbreak, from the possibility of deceit, from the possibility of losing him to someone whose intentions were far from pure. And as the day progressed, the quiet unease transformed into a determined vigilance. I began to retrace Zara's steps, her presence in our lives from the moment she had entered them, examining every word, every story, every fragment of information that could shed light on who she truly was and what she wanted from my son. And the more I dug, the more I began to see a pattern, a trail of carefully orchestrated moves designed to charm, to manipulate, to entangle families into webs of influence and control, a trail that had left devastation in its wake, financial ruin, emotional turmoil, and yet always leaving Zara herself untouched and scathed, protected by her ability to smile, to twist the truth, to hide behind charm and beauty. And my hands shook as I read account after account of people who had trusted her blindly, who had opened their homes, their hearts and their fortunes to her, only to be discarded when she had grown bored or satisfied with her gains. And I realized with a sudden cold clarity that the girl who stood poised to marry my son was not the innocent, bright young woman we had believed her to be, but a calculated force, a storm disguised in the soft petals of beauty and elegance. And fear mingled with anger in my chest, for how could anyone with such darkness in their heart hide it so completely under the mask of love and devotion that she had worn so effortlessly around Ion? And my mind turned to him, to his future, to the life we had worked so hard to create, and I knew that if this marriage went forward without intervention, he would be walking blindly into a trap, one that could shatter his world and leave him broken, and I could not let that happen. And so I began to plan my course carefully, quietly observing her every move, listening for the faintest slip, the smallest clue that could confirm what I already suspected. And I discovered things that confirmed my fears: her history with influential families, her involvement in business dealings that had ended in ruin for those who trusted her, her charming smile that had won over Countless hearts, and yet always with a hidden agenda, always a step ahead, and I realized that confrontation was necessary, but it had to be done with precision, with subtlety, for a direct accusation would only give her the chance to manipulate, to deflect, to twist the narrative against me, and I could not afford to give her that advantage. And as I continued my quiet investigation, I began to notice the small ways in which she controlled the environment, how she positioned herself in photographs, how she spoke to Ion in a tone that seemed loving but carried subtle commands, how she cultivated relationships with people who could be useful to her agenda, and I felt a surge of both admiration and horror for the brilliance of her deception, for the ease with which she could make people believe in her innocence while she quietly maneuvered behind the scenes to achieve her goals. And each revelation fueled my resolve to protect my son, fueled my determination to uncover every hidden facet of her plan and to ensure that Ion was never left vulnerable to her influence. And then came the message, the one that arrived on my phone from an unknown number, a brief cryptic warning that seemed to confirm everything I had feared, that she was not the person she appeared to be, and that I needed to act before it was too late. And my pulse quickened as I realized that the battle lines had been drawn, and that the seemingly perfect life we had envisioned for tomorrow was in danger of collapsing under the weight of deceit and betrayal. And I felt the weight of responsibility settle upon me, knowing that I could not rely solely on intuition, that I needed evidence and strategy, that I needed to prepare for the confrontation that would come before the vows were spoken, for the truth had to be revealed, and I could not allow emotions or sentimentality to cloud my judgment. And so I spent the remainder of the day meticulously observing, noting, recording every detail, every interaction, every subtle nuance of Zara's behavior, from the way she adjusted her dress to the way she smiled at Ion, to the fleeting glances that seemed laden with secret meaning. And each discovery strengthened my resolve and sharpened my focus, for I knew that knowledge was power, and that without it I could not protect my son from the consequences of marrying a woman whose intentions were hidden in shadows. And as evening approached and the house grew quiet once again, I sat alone, reflecting on the day, the revelations, the small hints of manipulation, the confirmations from strangers who had crossed paths with her in the past. And I felt the weight of both exhaustion and determination pressing upon me, the knowledge that tomorrow would be a turning point, that the choices made in the next 24 hours would define not just a wedding but the fate of a family. And in the stillness of the night, I made a silent vow to uncover every truth, to expose every hidden plan, to protect my son from heartbreak, from betrayal, from a life that was being carefully constructed around deception. And I understood that my role was not merely that of a mother of the groom, but of a guardian, a strategist, a force working behind the scenes to ensure that justice and truth prevailed in a world that was suddenly revealed to be far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. And with that vow etched into my soul, I prepared myself for the long night ahead, for the decisions I would need to make, for the courage I would need to summon for the confrontation that would come. And I closed my eyes for a brief moment, drawing in a deep, steadying breath, and felt the fire of determination ignite within me, knowing that tomorrow the veil would be lifted, the truth would emerge, and I would be ready to protect the person I loved most in the world, no matter the cost, no matter the risk, no matter the pain that awaited, for love and family demanded nothing less. And as the house settled into silence around me, I felt both fear and resolve intertwine, for the path ahead was uncertain, treacherous, and yet necessary. And I knew in my heart that there was no turning back, no retreat, no excuse to falter, for the moment of revelation was approaching, and I would face it head on with every ounce of strength, cunning, and love that I possessed. The day had arrived, and the air in the house was thick with anticipation, with excitement, with the invisible tension that seemed to hang over every corner, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath for what was about to unfold. I had spent the night before pacing in quiet contemplation, planning every step, every word, every gesture I would make, for the most delicate and important task of my life was now upon me, the protection of my son Ion from the carefully disguised threat that Zara had become. For months I had watched her every move, traced her Every word traced the hidden patterns in her behavior, noting the subtleties that most would dismiss, but which I could not ignore, for they whispered the truth of her intentions in the hidden recesses of her heart, and I knew that to confront her openly would be foolish. To attack with anger or accusation would only give her the chance to manipulate the situation, to twist reality to make herself the victim, while I would appear overbearing or paranoid. No, my revenge had to be silent. It had to be sweet, calculated. It had to strike without her realizing the hand that guided it, and so I moved with purpose, with patience, weaving my observations into small revelations, tiny seeds that would grow into doubts, suspicions, and ultimately the exposure of her true nature. And it began with a tea invitation under the guise of a casual pre-wedding chat, a moment for me to appear calm, gracious, nurturing, and yet to wield carefully the power of knowledge that I now possessed. And when she entered the room, her presence as radiant as ever, her perfume sweet and enveloping, I welcomed her with smiles, with gentle words, and the smallest gestures of warmth that concealed the storm that was building behind my eyes. She accepted the invitation gracefully, unaware of the web that was quietly tightening around her, and as we sat down and I poured the tea, my hand steady despite the fire that roared inside me, I spoke in measured tones about Ion, about his hopes, about the wedding, about the life ahead, all the while dropping subtle hints as if by accident, as if guided by the randomness of conversation, about past dealings that had been less than honorable, the whispers of scandal that had trailed her path, the lives of those who had once trusted her blindly and been left in ruin. And I watched as her eyes flickered the smallest twitch of discomfort, the brief pause in her practiced smile, the almost imperceptible tightening of her grip on the teacup, and I knew that each carefully chosen word was landing like a stone in a pond, sending ripples of doubt through the calm surface of her facade. And I let the silence stretch between us, allowing it to grow heavy, thick with meaning, as if the room itself was conspiring to reveal her secrets, while she tried to maintain control, to mask the fear that I could sense simmering just beneath the surface. And as we continued the conversation, I began to let slip other details, pieces of information that he had gathered over the weeks, proof that her charm was a mask, a tool, a weapon, proof that her smile had often been the prelude to manipulation, proof that the life she had presented to us was carefully constructed to deceive. And as the hours passed, she tried to counter my revelations with laughter, with deflection, with the same practiced ease that had allowed her to navigate so many situations before. But the cracks were beginning to show, the once flawless mask was starting to fracture, and I continued to observe, to record, to guide each subtle movement of truth, like a puppeteer unseen in the shadows, orchestrating the exposure of deceit without a single harsh word or confrontational tone. And the effect was profound. Those around us began to notice the shift, the subtle tension, the unspoken questions that lingered in the air, the faint looks exchanged between guests and friends that hinted at suspicion and doubt. And Zara could feel that she tried to regain control, tried to redirect the attention, tried to project confidence and innocence, but the seeds had already been sown, and the tiny cracks had already begun to widen. And I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness as I realized the depth of her deception, and the necessity of my actions for revenge in this case was not born of anger or spite, it was born of love, a love so fierce that I would do anything to protect my son from heartbreak, from betrayal, from a life that could have been irreparably damaged. And I began to weave small stories into conversation, hints that pointed to past indiscretions, connections with people we knew, stories she had thought forgotten, details she had hoped would never be discovered. And each revelation, carefully placed, each doubt subtly planted, was a blow to her control. And I could see her struggle, the tension in her jaw, the quickened blink of her eyes, the slight tremor in her fingers as she tried to maintain composure. And I knew that my silent strategy was working perfectly, that her elaborate construction of charm and innocence was now beginning to collapse under the quiet weight of truth. And as evening descended and the shadows grew long across the room, I allowed myself a moment to reflect on the path that had brought me here, on the knowledge that this battle was delicate, that misstep could undo all that I had worked for. And yet I felt a calm certainty that I was ready, that the careful orchestration of observation, manipulation, and revelation had prepared me to guide the situation to its inevitable conclusion. And I turned my attention back to Zara, her movements measured, her words polite but laced with the tension she could no longer hide. And I allowed myself a small inner smile, knowing that soon the hidden realities that had threatened to destroy our family would be fully exposed. And I continued to speak slowly, deliberately, carefully, choosing each word to reveal another fragment, another truth, another piece of the puzzle, until she was forced to navigate a labyrinth of doubt and fear that she had never anticipated. And the process was almost intoxicating, the power of knowledge, of observation, of strategy carefully deployed to protect my son, to safeguard the future of our family, while ensuring that the person who had tried to manipulate and deceive was left with no recourse, no defenses. And as the night wore on, I noticed the subtle ways in which her confidence faltered, the Fleeting looks of panic that crossed her features, the almost imperceptible hesitation in her speech, and I understood that my plan was working, that the quiet, sweet revenge I had plotted for so long was now unfolding, exactly as I had intended, and each small victory, each carefully orchestrated moment of exposure was a step toward protecting the one I loved most, the realization that love and revenge could coexist, that protection and strategy were not mutually exclusive but intertwined in a delicate dance, and I felt a surge of pride mixed with exhaustion, knowing that the path I had chosen was both necessary and righteous, and I continued to maneuver, guiding the conversation, letting the pieces fall into place, letting the house itself bear witness to the subtle unmasking of someone who had hidden behind beauty and charm for far too long. And as the final hours approached, I felt the tension in the room peak, the quiet suspense so thick it could almost be felt in the air, the slow, inevitable crumbling of deception, and I knew that soon the truth would be undeniable, that the veil would be lifted, that my son would be spared the heartbreak, the betrayal that had threatened him, and I felt a deep sense of fulfillment, the knowledge that careful, patient planning had allowed me to turn fear into strategy, that love had guided me through treacherous terrain, that revenge had been sweet because it had been necessary and precise. And as I finally allowed myself to rest for a brief moment before the culmination of my efforts, I reflected on the journey, the observations, the revelations, the careful manipulation, and I realized that this night would be remembered not for anger or cruelty but for the quiet power of love, the strength of a mother willing to do whatever it took to protect her child, and the sweet satisfaction of watching deception unravel under the weight of truth. And I knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow, when all was revealed, when the truth came to light, the consequences of her actions would fall where they belonged, and my son would be safe and our family intact. And in that moment, the quiet satisfaction of justice mingled with the enduring love I held for Ion, and I felt ready for the final confrontation to guide the moment when lies would be exposed, when betrayal would be seen for what it was, and I would stand unwavering, my heart fierce, my mind sharp, my purpose clear, ready to ensure that the storm of deception that had threatened us would pass, leaving us stronger, united, and wiser than before. And with that thought, I allowed myself to breathe, knowing that the silent, sweet revenge I had crafted with care, patience, and love would soon reach its completion, and the night was ours to navigate, to shape, to control, and I would see it through, no matter the challenge, no matter the obstacle, no matter the cost. The wedding day had finally arrived, and the house was alive with movement, with anticipation, with the faint hum of excitement that seemed to vibrate through the walls, from the ornate floral arrangements that filled every corner to the soft golden light that spilled across polished floors, to the gentle music that drifted through the air. Everything was a picture of perfection, and yet beneath the surface a storm was quietly brewing, for the delicate threads of truth that I had spent weeks uncovering were now ready to be revealed, and I could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on my shoulders, the knowledge that every word, every glance, every small gesture had the power to protect or to shatter. And I moved through the house with careful precision, observing the interactions, noting the subtle tensions, the fleeting expressions, the silent communications that passed between guests, for the eyes of many had already begun to sense the cracks in the facade that Zara had so carefully constructed, and I watched as she moved with grace through the rooms, her smile radiant, her posture perfect, yet her eyes flickered with something that betrayed the calm exterior, something that hinted at the panic that was beginning to simmer beneath the surface. And I knew that the time for subtlety had arrived, that the moment to reveal the truth, to expose the carefully. I positioned myself quietly observant, patient, and ready to act at the right moment, for I had learned that confrontation required timing and poise, that revelation carried more power when delivered with control and with precision. And so I watched as Ion approached the altar, his face radiant, his heart full of hope, oblivious to the shadow that had lurked behind the veil of beauty and charm, for I could see the love in his eyes, the trust he placed in Zara, the innocence with which he had stepped into a situation that could have cost him everything. And I felt a mixture of pride and anguish, knowing that my role as mother, protector, strategist had never been more crucial, for I could not allow the culmination of his happiness to be stolen by deception, by manipulation, by a carefully disguised betrayal. And as Zara approached him, her smile luminous, her demeanor composed, yet beneath the surface tension threaded through every motion, every glance, every gesture, and I felt the careful work I had done begin to bear fruit. The seeds of doubt, suspicion, and awareness that I had planted over weeks had taken root in the minds of those around us.